Welcome everyone to another Systemic Formulas webcast. We're really excited to have you here today. There's a few issues, as you know, regarding the GI tract that we want to cover today that I think are underrepresented in our discussions. I love talking about probiotics. I love talking about prebiotics, but what we don't spend enough time on, I believe, is the terrain. The terrain is something that we really want to introduce to you today and put it in the context of an overall healthy GI tract, including how it responds to probiotics and prebiotics as we wrap this up today. So thanks for joining us, and I'm really excited about this tonight. And I'm also joined by Mike Reese, our clinical consultant out of the office. So if you have questions post-webcast, certainly reach out to Mike, and he can track me down. I mean, apparently I'm tough to track down occasionally, but we want to make sure that's possible, right?
Not that bad.
And those of you that didn't join us at our last event as well, you have to come to the next events because we're really setting you up for the most phenomenal journey down to GI wellness in the next few years. You have to keep coming to our events. But that being said, let me get right into our task today, which is covering terrain. What is terrain? Let me give you an analogy of terrain, as though most of us understand terrain geologically. For example, the soil, the soil around the world. Let's pick Utah, for example. We have desert terrain, which can be strictly sand. We have a more temperate terrain, which can be fertile, but it's drier, but it's very fertile. It's full of living organisms. And then in really, really north-facing slopes, we can have almost a high altitude rainforest, so to speak. But even if you take that into consideration, you can look at the different terrains around the globe, rainforest all the way to a desert. And those are terrains, and we have terrains inside of our body. We have and today is GI. We're not going to talk about skin terrain, but we'll talk about the GI terrain. We have, beginning down the GI pathway, we have our mouth. All the terrains that we're going to talk about have a higher temperature, their body temperature, and they're moist, and that's critical. Right? We have to be cognizant of those two issues as we move along. But we have the terrain of the mouth, and then we enter the stomach, which is a much harsher terrain. I mean, when we think of the stomach, we're going to think of something really harsh like our desert terrain because of the acid concentration of that terrain, high acid terrain. And then as we leave that terrain, we go back to a neutral pH, but now we have a much more diverse terrain. Now this terrain changes in terms of its complexity, the tissues, the folds that you find in the duodenum and the ileum and the jejunum, and actually the real order is duodenum, jejunum, ileum. They gradually get more and more complex in terms of your own tissue. The villi increase in number, you get more and more folds. Why is that? Because that's where we absorb most of our nutrients, right? That terrain then ends up heading into what we call the colon, where we have the ascending, trans, and descending colon. And then finally, the terrain leaves our body through the rectum, and that is the journey that we take. But I think we should break that down, Mike. I think we should break that down into different pieces.
Yeah.
So beginning with the mouth. There's some things in the mouth that I think that you and I have talked about in the past. What's an important aspect of the mouth when we think of it as a terrain?
It's definitely the gateway. I mean, it's where everything begins.
That's right.
And, I've been told by colon hydrotherapists before that it's very important to chew up your food before, you want to chew it up, you want to take your time with that. And not only is that because you want to be able to swallow it when it's in, the proper state, but you want to take the time so that it has that enzymatic activity in your mouth before it goes down into the more harsh environment, like you say.
Yeah, and not only that, the mastication or the chewing triggers a ton of receptors in the mouth. One of them releases more salivary fluids, right? And we'll get back to salivary in a second, but salivary is amazing fluid. We got to maintain that fluid. Secondly, it triggers these receptors to tell the body and the brain, guess what? Food is on its way. So it primes the stomach, it primes the intestines, it primes the pancreas, primes the liver. All these priming sensations happen because as that food it goes through our body, each stage is going to be different. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but in the mouth, there is that priming event, both hormonally, enzymatically, and remember, that's connected to the brain. And so the brain now knows, hey, we got food coming. Let's get, the blood flow can change. The enteric nervous system is now ready to go. There's a lot of really amazing phenomena that happen with this. So we start with the mouth, and then we head next to
the esophagus.
the esophagus.
Well, based on what you were saying there, it kind of begs the question, with the hectic lifestyle that's so common right now, where commonly people their stress levels are high when they sit down to finally be able to eat. They're either urgent to get back to work because their lunch break is, they've got a tight window of time, or for different reasons,
whether it's their desk because they're in a hurry, they don't want.
They're now just breaking this fast, whether they've been fasting or not, but they haven't eaten in a while. I think there's that common tendency for people to rush eating, and so if they are in that stress state and they're not taking the time to prepare their food and in chewing, then what happens? You talked about the systems and how they are all related and intertwined, the pancreas and how that responds. You're preparing your organs for digestion.
Right.
Then what happens?
So now when you underchew, of course, the first impact is now you have a lot of unchewed food that enters the stomach, right? It transients the esophagus. And by the way, as it's going down the esophagus, when it's unchewed and they're larger chunks, it can actually scar the esophagus. So you'll notice some people, there are many people, and there's a genetic component here, but there's also just the fact that you don't chew your food well enough. As a large chunk has to go through a narrow opening, it can start scarring and removing mucosa from those tissues. And you'll notice some people complain that they get food stuck. Oh yeah, when I eat, food always gets stuck. That's an issue. That's an underchewing, under-enzymatic process. They're not, their enzymes aren't functioning properly, and they're not chewing well enough. That's the first thing that you notice when you don't chew well enough. The second thing is when you load up the stomach with a lot of unchewed food, it makes it much more difficult to digest. So that can delay the gastric emptying process, which can then trigger some issues because the body is timed. There is a rhythm to it. You underdigest, which means you don't extract nutrients now, because the enzymes that are excreted in the hydrochloric acid, they're not able to penetrate large chunks very well. Now you empty that into the intestine and they're still too big. So you have a nutrient extraction issue. You have a pH issue because now larger chunks don't alter the pH as well. And a lot of people at that point worry about taking antacids when really the opposite's true. We're not going to get into much of that today, and we have a product called APHA that helps with that, and these enzymes will help with that, but they think they need to take antacid when really their acidity needs to increase, not decrease, right? That's another phenomenon that happens. Now we enter into the small intestine, right? The jejunum, duodenum, ileum. This is where all the uptake happens. So now we have a couple of other organs that come into play here. As we're leaving the stomach, we now have the pancreas that comes into play and the liver gallbladder, right? Especially the gallbladder, of course. Well, those two organs secrete a lot of amazing compounds. The pancreatic enzymes. Without them, you wouldn't be digesting well. The pancreas can be overworked. It cannot work as well because of the earlier processes, because of some of the, as we both mentioned, the hormonal triggers that need to, as well as just it's overworked. The pancreas can be overworked because you're eating maybe too frequently. There's this concept that you don't want to eat too frequently because now you're constantly working those organs. You need a break. You need a time for these things to re-engage and rest and come back on play. Because remember, your digestive system still has food in it at night unless you've fasted. So it's still working even when you're not. That's an issue. We'll revisit that as we get to the product section of this. But we have the pancreas that needs to be healthy and working properly to release those enzymes. What do those enzymes do? Well, primarily the main three are pancreatic enzymes, which contain proteases. And I want to remind everybody what a protease is. A protease is an enzyme. It's a protein, by the way. All enzymes are proteins, which is why we need our proteins, and it's also why we need cofactors like minerals. People often don't think of this, but minerals are so important. The magnesium, the zincs, the coppers, they're so important for the enzymes in our body. Without these minerals, the enzymes don't work. So if you're low on minerals, your enzymes don't function properly. But these enzymes are made of protein. And what they are is they're an engine. They're a motor that does a job. For example, a protease is designed to chew up proteins. Proteins are long chains of amino acids. And what that enzyme does is it comes in and it chews up that protein and makes individual amino acids from it. So you take this big protein and you chew it up into its individual components, amino acids. You then have lipases. Lipases attack fats, and they break up fats, triglycerides, and they convert them into fatty acids. And they can also release glycerol as a byproduct. Both those things are extremely important, right? Fatty acids for energy and other membrane issues, as well as glycerol for some of the pathways that we work with on the glycolytic cycle or the Krebs cycle. Or you can remanufacture these glycolipids later. And then finally, we have amylases. They chew up carbohydrates. But again, they're a protein. All three of these enzymes are proteins that chew up a large particle and break it down into its components. While amylases chew up large particles and release things like fructose and glucose. Sometimes lactose. That's normally a lactase enzyme that some people lack, by the way. And then there's some other sugars we talk about in a lesser way, but that's what the enzymes do. These enzymes released from the pancreas do just that. They chew these things up into their components, whether they be amino acids from proteins, sugars from carbohydrates, or fatty acids from fats. What happens next, though, is you still have to deal with some of these things, like the fats. Fats don't like to be in a water environment, which is what your GI is. So along comes the bile. Bile helps absorb fats. It has an amazing number of bile salts, bile acids, and things that help you really sequester and create little tiny cells of fats, not unlike our HDL and LDLs and things. Bile also does something else that we'll get back to in a minute. It changes the terrain. So both of these enzymes will change the terrain. The enzymes and the bile affect the way the body works. And the pancreatic secretions also change the pH. All of this changes the terrain. It's about terrain today. We started with the mouth terrain, which is mostly neutral. You got some enzymes and you have your secretions, right? Salivary secretions. And then you need the stomach where you have a high acid terrain. We now, in the small intestine where the terrain is now changed to neutral, we have some bile, we have some enzymes, we have some other neutralizing agents, the carbonates. That changes the terrain. These organisms that we worry about as the biome and the prebiotics have to survive these different terrain changes. And so do pathogens. And we'll get back to that. But the terrain is key to not only our health, our tissue's health, but the microbiome as it relates to our terrain. As we go through this process now, the complexity of the small intestine changes a lot of things. There's a lot of now amino acids there. It's a thick milieu of amino acids and lipids, and the bile's moving through, and you do have a lot of bacteria from your food, just from what you've eaten, just general bacteria that comes from the plants and the animals that you've eaten. And now you have all these cells, these little villi trying to extract everything. And then you have the immune system in there doing its job. So there's a lot going on in the small intestine. Not as much in terms of microbial activity as when it enters the colon. Now we have all that entering the colon. And as you know, the colon is rich in organisms, but not as much nutrient extraction. So in the colon, we're talking about the bacteria and fungi and virus that ferment, that change food that we can't change. Again, it's a very different terrain when you go from the small intestine to the large. It changes the terrain one more time. And this is a whole fermenting part of our body. And fermenters change carbohydrates primarily, and some peptides, proteins that we can't handle with our pancreatic and our bile secretions. These are things that your body needs the organisms in order to extract the next level of nutrients out of. And you've had a lot of people talk to you about the colon aspect of our health. I mean, is there anything in particular you want to share today with me?
A question I have for you, you talked about the pancreas. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, the pancreatic enzymes and when they come to play. I know that many of you have asked about our pancreas-specific products. So number one, we have P pancreas. Number two, we have PS pancreas. Yep. In your opinion, how much would either of those or both of those in tandem help with that pancreatic enzyme production? If the pancreas is out of whack or it's underperforming,
Yeah.
If we're strengthening that, then in turn, is that going to actually help with the digestive or the pancreatic enzyme production?
Yeah, indeed it will. And I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't bring those with me today. But there are two very critical key products that we normally think of in terms of helping the pancreas, right? There's a lot of other issues that can be dealt with regarding the pancreas. Today we're talking about terrain, and the pancreas is very, very critical for the terrain that I described. Its secretions into the small intestine are absolutely critical for the health of your digestive system, the tissue around it, the terrain, as well as the probiotics that we want to keep, our commensal bacteria, our microbiome. All three of those areas are extremely reliant upon the pancreas. So it's a critical piece. So yes, remember, the P and the PS are critical to the health of our terrain, for sure. Because the pancreas, one of the messages I'm going to repeat, and I need you to write this down, everyone, multiple times today, is this is a terrain talk, but the reason we're giving you a terrain talk is because we want to describe to you how the different aspects of the GI terrain, how they improve not only your health, your tissue's health, but the microbiome's health. Because they are they are the same beast. They're two organs that live together. And we can't separate them anymore. We can't talk about them as separate things. They both interrelate so intimately that they're critical. And the terrain, like the soil analogy, that soil analogy, what does soil do for us? Besides, I mean, there's a lot of things, but one of the main things it does is it helps us grow plants, right? That's what soil does in different ways, in different varieties, whether it be a cactus or whether it be a large redwood tree. That's what the soil does for you. It maintains the ability to grow life. That's what the terrain in our GI tract does. It maintains our ability to grow healthy microbial life. And when that terrain is messed up, and when we become exposed to the wrong organisms, we can start growing the wrong things in the wrong places, right? We can grow pathogens, we can grow fungus, we can grow viruses that replicate in there. When our terrain isn't healthy, our microbiome and our tissue can be unhealthy. So the terrain is critical. And that is really the gist of today, is about terrain and how it relates to both our organs and the microbiome. So your question is valid. Yes, pancreas for sure. You could add to that LB, right? Liver, gallbladder. You could add that to the same situation, that a healthy gallbladder is critical for the terrain. And I would add to that when people remove their gallbladder so whimsically, so nonchalantly, that should be questioned. You don't need the gallbladder to survive. But what we don't know, and we clearly need to understand more deeply, is how the gallbladder affects the terrain. When you remove the gallbladder, you're changing your microbiome, henceforward. And the other piece to this is commensal organisms that we want to live with us, that we've developed evolutionarily and this great symbiotic relationship with, they have the ability to withstand gallbladder acids. So gallbladder is another way of an antibiotic in some sense. There are a number of pathogens that won't survive bile. Bile kills them. That's one of the reasons we secrete bile, not just to absorb fat and to do other things. We secrete it because it will kill certain microorganisms. Commensal organisms, things that we need and want in our body, they can survive bile. So it's critical that it's there, right? I think it's another area of this terrain argument that please keep the gallbladder if you can. That's an argument that I would make, because it affects us in ways that we clearly don't fully understand regarding our microbiome and the terrain. Yeah.
So Shayne, what I found often, or it's not uncommon for there to be a patient that has had their gallbladder removed. Mm-hmm. As critical as it is, so now that they're without a gallbladder, and going forward, when you're considering how much that shifts not only the microbiome, but the terrain, like you're talking about, what are some things for people to keep in mind? I mean, can we still have success with these products we're going to touch on?
Yeah.
And when they don't have a gallbladder?
We can, but you bring up the point of consuming bile salts with a meal is a great way to supplement the gallbladder. And we have products with bile salts in them. We have the D-Digest. We have LB, gallbladder. These are products that when you consume them, you're getting bile salts. That will help deliver bile salts to this part of the body that can affect the terrain. So people that don't have a gallbladder, I believe they should be consuming these bile salts with meals. It'll also help them absorb fats better, healthy fats. And we all know that we need healthy fats. And if they've removed their gallbladder, their body is not getting what it needs on a daily basis. So yeah,
so not to go off on too deep off on a tangent, but Vista 1, is that an example of bile salts?
No, the bile salts they're literally bile. We get bile from an animal.
Oh, okay.
It's literally a bile, and we put it into products like D and
I thought Vista 1 had it, but
those are amazing fats, but the bile salts are literally a bile. It's a dried bile.
Got it. Yeah.
They're there. Yeah. One thing you're thinking about Vista that comes from bile salts are phospholipids. So phospholipids, like in Vista 1 and 2, and those phospholipids are part of bile salts, but only one part. Okay. Steroids, cholesterol is another bile salt. It's another part of the bile complex, but you need to eat bile if you don't have it. It'll help you in this terrain argument, and it'll help you with your fat absorption. Yeah. So it's a great point. Once we get, so I think we've brought everybody down to the colon, right? And the colon, like I said, is a big fermenting deal. And hopefully, if you've done your job all the way down, what you've left the colonic tissue with and the colonic microbiome with are a number of great nutrients that we underrepresent in our discussions. And those are things like herbal components, golden seal, and all of these unique fibers or other compounds found in the herbal world, as well as specific nutrients that we really covet in terms of complex carbohydrates that we can't digest, right? Things that our body doesn't make the enzymes for, but your microbiome does. So it's a different terrain that now ends up fermenting and giving you a lot of amazing compounds. Most often these compounds are plant-based, by the way. That's the story of the system. Now let's go back up and kind of work down it in the product world again. How can we affect our terrain in different ways? Affecting the mouth terrain is difficult. Now there are in our products we use nutrients, like in the enzymes, for example, like in NZ, mela, NZ gluten. Some of these have ingredients that, like golden seal, for example, that can help stimulate salivary response, which is great. I mean, masticating is one, but we have some ingredients that stimulate. You'll notice when you take certain supplements, you might get a salivary response. That's a good thing. Salivary bathing of your oral microbiome is critical for the microbiome health. So it's a terrain we want to support. So there are a number of these products, NZ mela and NZ gluten, that can help do that. As we move down to the stomach, we want to take care of the enzymatic process there. And again, I'm going to refer back to NZ mela and gluten here, or Z gluten, excuse me. So this is Z gluten, this is mela, and this is NZ. Sorry, my fingers are right in the way. These not only affect the enzymatic process, but they can help you digest food that didn't get properly chewed. They can help that digestive process begin. And many of these enzymes are acid resistant to a degree, so they survive in the stomach and make it past the stomach into the small intestine, again, helping you digest. Because the digestion process is critical for the terrain, as we've just discussed. So these enzymes come in play here. Now we move into the small intestine, and things get really complicated here, and we can jump back into some of the things you brought up, which are Pancreas. Before we do that, I want to highlight a few things. When you look at some of the ingredients we're still in the stomach, mind you. I want to stay in the stomach, and I want to point out a few ingredients. For example, I want to point out golden seal again, and golden seal is NZ gluten. I also want to point out here in the milk thistle, we'll get back to that. So golden seal, and in our L-gut, which we're going to get to in a second, we've got L-alanine, L-glutamine, okay, and then we also have some compounds like mushroom, and it's lion's mane. There's certain ingredients that we've included in these formulations, especially in L-gut and some of our digestive enzymes, that we've seen can help produce mucosa. Now, why would we want to produce mucosa? Mucosa is the thing that helps everything slide down our gullet, first of all. And that's the old thinking. The new thinking is mucosa is really one of the main features of our microbiome's terrain. where our microbiome live. If the microbiome live in the food moving through you, the microbiome is going to move through you and exit you. That's not what we want, right? We want a microbiome that lives in the mucosa, so it's trapped with you, it stays with you. It's safe from other things going on, but it's not living on the tissue. So you have your tissue, endothelial tissue, you have your mucosa, and then you have the lumen, or the stuff moving through you, all the food and stuff moving through you, the waste, right? The food and the waste. That mucosa is rich with our microbiome. It's critical that we have a really great microbiome living there. There are herbs in these formulas that help stimulate and maintain mucosa. And I'm gonna mention one area, because we're in the stomach, that's critical. A thinning mucosa is dangerous for something called H. pylori. H. pylori can attack tissue when that mucosa thins. And when it thins too far, the H. pylori can come in contact with your stomach lining, and then we have problems. Otherwise, H. pylori can actually be thought of as a commensal bacteria for many people, an otherwise harmless organism. So mucosa is critical in terms of maintaining terrain, and we've included ingredients that help maintain a mucosal environment, a healthy mucosal environment.
So uniquely, what I found is that customers will be looking for a digestive enzyme support. Okay. So they find that these are our digestive enzyme supports, these 3 products.
Yeah.
But then surprisingly, there's more in there than just protease, lipase, amylase to digest the macronutrition.
Right.
You have, like you're touching on, these other compounds. And so I think you've touched on why that is, and why we combine other herbs and other compounds like golden seal and others,
it's a great
spearmint,
point.
to help with that. So when you look at Z-gluten, for example, not only is it a digestive enzyme, but it does have a variety of other compounds. What was the main reason for that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So Z-gluten is, as you said, it's a very powerful protease, and there's some amylase and lipase in there too. There's some other enzymes that digest these larger compounds. But we focused on proteins, especially proteins that our body does not have the ability to break down. Furthermore, to your question, they are the proteins that can sometimes cause trouble. They tend to be the gliadins, prolamines. They tend to be proteins found in grains, gluten being one of those, right? That's just a single member of a family of proteins that was designed, Z-gluten was designed around those proteins first and foremost, and then other difficult to digest proteins and carbohydrates that we might experience, like cellulase, which cellulose we can't digest, but Z-gluten has cellulase in it, so that we can digest some plant matrices to release plant compounds into your digestive tract, which is what you want. You don't want them to be tied up in the plant. You want to release them. Why would we want to destroy those enzymes? Destroy those proteins. These are proteins that can wreak a little bit of havoc. We know that gluten can be problematic. It has there's some immuno issues that can be brought about by gluten sensitivities. Your immune system can respond to gluten in some people. Gluten is found in way too much in too many foods. It's ubiquitous, and that's not healthy. And then finally, as we get to another product we have shown here, we have something that we worry about in terms of, we call it leaky gut, but what we worry about is the tight junctions throughout our body, but specifically in the small intestine. When you open up tight junctions, you allow for a lot of transfer of proteins and foreign particles through into the bloodstream or into the lymph tissue. And in either case, that leaky gut can create, now we truly have an immunological response, because now you have a lot of debris entering into an area that it shouldn't be, because you've opened up a tight junction. What's a tight junction? A tight junction is, we're made of billions of cells. As you look at us, we look pretty smooth, but each and every cell here and along all of us is touching another cell. And especially in the GI tract, they not only touch, but they're connected using proteins that are tight junction proteins. They open and close for various reasons. Usually it's a body-directed response. But when you have something like gluten enter some people's bodies, it can interfere with something called zonulin, and that zonulin directs the opening and closing, and you can open up tight junctions because of the exposure to gluten and other gliadins and prolamines, other tight proteins, they can open these tight junctions when you don't want them open. And when they do, now we've got this rush of debris, protein, and other antigens, which stimulate the antibody response, and now we have a problem. Now we have an immune problem. That brings us to L-gut, right? So now we say, okay, from Z-gluten, when we know we want to prevent these proteins from triggering that tight junction issue, we also want to protect the tight junctions and stimulate a lot of other cellular mechanisms to control tight junctions through L-gut. Right? So there's this relationship here that happens from an enzyme standpoint where we want to maintain the destruction of these proteins so they don't trigger this response. But if you have this response, which many people do, they've already have open tight junctions, and it isn't just gluten that does that, but there are other things that can trigger, like inflammation will trigger this. We have to take care of both pieces. We have to start maintaining our tight junctions and destroying anything that they're being exposed to that could open them. That's the premise with these two enzymes. Can you take this preventatively? You know, there's a caveat here. One, you can take it preventatively, but two, if someone's celiac, avoidance is still the best thing, because one, a true celiac person, this may not protect them from every single gluten molecule that goes in there, and that can be a problem for them. So I definitely don't want doctors thinking that a celiac person can eat gluten because they're taking this. No, that's a very high-risk situation, not something that we want to potentiate. But for sensitivities and other things, absolutely. This is amazing to destroy the gluten protein. We've shown that it destroys gluten protein in lab tests, and we've also done some objective studies with people that have sensitivities, and we fed this to them while feeding them gluten, and their symptoms were extremely well reduced. And so it was a nice thing. But again, avoid celiac. So that's an enzyme piece. And I know you have more questions about enzymes, but that's how these tie together. Right? In the digestive process, destroying provocative proteins, and then the L-gut in helping keep tight junctions healthy and closed. Yeah.
So
and we can get more. This will come back later. We'll talk about this in a minute, the tight junction piece, because that's critical to our microbiome terrain. But
many people are familiar with glutamine, and it's the most abundant amino acid in the body, and it helps with muscle recovery and helps with rebuilding your body's tissues. But with that said, why wouldn't someone just go buy a container of glutamine, 5 grams of glutamine, as opposed to looking at, the entire formula?
These complex things, yeah.
To help with the leaky gut.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Permeability.
Now remember, glutamine has multiple jobs. One of those, like you say, can be involved in digestive health. It's also good for muscle building, and it's one of the main amino acids that holds on to nitrogen. It becomes a nitrogen transporter, because you can cut off an amine group off of glutamine and make glutamate, right? But it donates an amine group to different functions. So it has a number of roles. However, if you just go after a single molecule, like just go after glutamine, you're pushing, in the biochemistry world and in our bodies, being more complex things than we want to believe, you're pushing a single mechanism. You remember those old biochemical pathways? I never want someone to push a single biochemical pathway, because that biochemical pathway isn't an island, it doesn't live on its own. It's connected to other ones. So if you push a single cycle and you ignore these other cycles, you're really not doing the best job you can do. Because if you push this cycle, you could deplete, let's say, for example, magnesium, because the enzymes that utilize glutamine require magnesium. So now you're eating up magnesium while you're doing this glutamine push, and you're ignoring these other cycles that need to be dealt with, like other nitrogen cycles, for example. So I always say, please, I don't mind pushing a single if you push all of the other elements that are required to meet the entire global picture, not just a piece of the puzzle, but the entire puzzle. That's my take on it.
So hence the reason for having other invaluable ingredients in the whole formula of L-gut. The rhubarb, the golden seal, the lion's mane mushroom.
Allantoin, there's so many. There's a bunch of plants in there. And we'll get back to that when we get to the, now that we're at the intestinal junction, we can talk about that. But you're right. The complexity it's by design. It's not an accident. It's not, we as a company never go after a single sourced molecule. That's just not what we do, right? We're a much more comprehensive, complex, synergistic company for sure. And it is, you're right, you'll see that on labels and you'll wonder, goodness gracious, look at all those. Is that really necessary? And we believe it is. Yeah. We do. We definitely believe it's necessary, and we enjoy the results we get, because when you look at these, there are certain compounds that we've placed in these formulas. When you actually become a label reader and look at these plants and these other things that we've placed in here, some of the carbohydrates and some of the plant compounds, they are exerting new effects on, like the microbiome, for example, that we didn't predict when we first did it. We just knew from whether it be ethnobotanical, whether it be coming out of Africa or India or Asia, the way they used these herbs, we said, hey, if they've used an herb for healthy gut for 5,000 years, we're not going to discount that just because we don't have the science yet. The science will come, which is what's happening. We're getting the science, but we've already employed the long-term use of that botanical in our formulas. And then we also take the ones that have science. We combine them both. But that's really the amazing part to this story, is that it does affect more than one part of the terrain. And again, the terrain is made up of our tissue and the microbiome's tissues, right? The microbiome cells. That's the terrain that we want to bring together and make them happy.
Some patients or clinicians often want to know or have an idea of, okay, if my patient's going to undergo a protocol with these products or these products in addition to others, how long is this going to last? Every patient's different. I realize that. Every patient who does have leaky gut, for example, is in a different scenario than the other person. But when we have established protocols we put in place, but they want to know what the expectation is as far as, okay, I've got this patient that has XYZ symptoms. If I put them on Z-gluten and L-gut, what should be my expectation? Or is this something they're going to have to take indefinitely for
That's a great point. So
throughout the year?
Let's look at the system we've built today. Whether it be, we'll stick to the stomach and the intestine, including the pancreas and liver. When you look at that system, just that little piece, so stomach, pancreas, liver, small intestine, just those pieces. You want to say, okay, if they're struggling, if these clinicians have tested and seen that both the liver and the pancreas need help, you need the LB and the P pancreas or PS, along with these enzymes, until the testing reveals that these tissues are getting better or the symptoms are getting better, which in my opinion would take a minimum of 30 days to experience some improved GI behavior, for example. And that could be in terms of feeling better, in terms of just the bowel movements, the gas production, the cramping, things of that nature, as well as the nutrient uptake. They feel like they're getting more from their food because of these, when you're using these formulas, you're getting more out of each meal. That can happen in 30 days. The long term, if they have serious leaky gut, they have serious pancreatic or gallbladder issues or missing a gallbladder, you're looking at extending that out months and months for sure, right? You're going to move that way out into the realm of much longer periods. But along that path, along that journey, you should be seeing improvements with these GI issues. The microbiome, by the way, will start benefiting from these same concepts. The microbiome benefits from these enzymes. It benefits from L-gut. And that's kind of the next piece to this talk is, we've talked about the body's benefit, benefiting the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, trying to improve the functions of these tissues, trying to improve the function of the mucosal lining in the stomach and the acid production, things like that. But what about the biome? Well, the biome lives from here all the way down. We've got a biome in every orifice. So when we improve the biome, we start to also notice improvements, because the biome helps us do our job in all of these cases. The biome makes enzymes. The biome makes nutrients. The biome digests your food for you and does different extractions and things. The biome enjoys enzymes. It enjoys having these things around. Why? Remember, I talked about the mucosa, where they live. I talked about the food moving through. The enzymes and things will help the biome extract nutrients. Your biome needs the same nutrients you do. The biome needs, in many cases, the acetates and the magnesium and the zinc and the riboflavin. The biome needs those same nutrients. It's an amazing phenomenon, but half of the stuff we eat feeds the biome, feeds the microbiome, as well as feeds you. And we found that in our studies, in our own laboratory studies, with our brand new probiotics that we are now making, I have found that they don't like to be alive unless you're giving them the same nutrients we need. Antioxidants, certain polyphenolics and flavonoids. It's amazing how intimately tied they are to us. Our plant-based diet is required not just for us, but for our microbiome. So as we affect that area, that terrain between our body and the microbiome, that mucosal, really neat area all the way along, we're healing, we're taking care of the microbiome, and we're in response, it's taking care of us, and our tissues are being taken care of. That's what's critical with this process. So how does that work? Well, we know, for example, that leaky gut is intimately associated with dysbiosis, or a faulty microbiome. A microbiome that isn't colonized properly, isn't working properly, can actually lead to leaky gut, and vice versa. So it's this nice, it's a bidirectional pathway. A healthy microbiome leads to healthy tight junctions, and vice versa. So we talk about this, that there are a number of ingredients in this formula that are designed for the tissue itself, the endothelial tissue in the small intestine, but there's also a number of ingredients that are designed for the microbiome that lives in those areas of the small intestine that helps us digest food and so on. So it's a dual purpose because it's a bidirectional relationship. The enzymes can do the same thing. Enzymes can help. The more digestion, the more enzymes you have eroding protein and carbohydrates that can pile up in a digestive tract. Think about it. Think about your stuff moving through your body, and you have that mucosal layer that helps it move, and that is the home of your microbiome, at least a big chunk of it. And then your tissue, as this stuff's moving through, if you don't have proper digesting of all of those larger compounds, they can get stuck in there. They can help build, especially in our colon, where they start to get stuck in the nooks and crevices, right? And then what happens when you get debris stuck in crevices of our intestines? Well, it can build up. It can become a catch point for other debris, and it can start to create a stopping point or a choke point, as well as an inflammatory point. And we've seen that over and over again with inflammatory diseases in the bowel, right? IBS, IBD, Crohn's. I mean, there's certain foods that you can't eat when you have these inflammatory issues because they get stuck. Well, the more digestive enzyme for the terrain, it breaks down some of these larger compounds that can get stuck, these larger proteins, these larger carbohydrates. It helps us get rid of those in the terrain, especially for someone that is in a weakened or a lesser than optimal state of digestion. That's the criticality of some of these formulas.
Yeah, more often than not, people are using these once they've gotten to that point of where they need the therapy, and they're perhaps in that state where they've built up that debris in their intestinal tract. And so they want to know that these formulas can help yield those results.
And it's really critical in that part of the body. I haven't spent as much time in the colon yet, but what I want to summarize again to illustrate, when you take the journey down your GI, there is an interface between the microbiome and us, and I call that the terrain. Much of it's made up of the mucosal tissue, right? The mucosal polysaccharides and things where it lives, but that is the terrain from beginning to end, and it's the terrain that has to be healthy. When that terrain gets too thin, when that terrain lacks nutrients, when that terrain lacks microbiome, it will absolutely affect our health. So this is about terrain. We've talked on a few talking points. What helps us our terrain? Enzymes help our terrain. Bile helps our terrain, so our gallbladder and our pancreas. Of course, our salivary output, the mouth and the chewing helps our terrain. But plants and other compounds found in these formulas really provide some incredible nutrients to the terrain, to maintain the terrain. And then the terrain in turn maintain the microbiome, which in turn maintains our tissue. So it's this little junction, this little space of amazing material that's otherwise annoying when you have a cold, right? If you have a cold or your body's trying to secrete foreign invaders or dust or something, that's all that mucosa you produce. It's annoying when you have a cold because you're just producing gallons of it. And you wonder how your body does it. It does it because there's so many cells that line those tissues that can produce mucosal terrain. Now, there's other times you produce it when you need to evacuate your diarrhea. You produce a lot of mucosa, or if you're throwing up, you produce a lot of mucosa. It gets rid of things as much as maintain that. But that little terrain there is so critical for our health. And today we're talking about the things that help maintain terrain. Unfortunately, I don't have the pancreas or the gallbladder product here, and I think you mentioned another one. Oh, forgive me.
I thought Vista 1 had the bile salts.
But D-digest.
Yeah. D-digest.
D can have some of those too. Yeah, D and I think L-gut has the bile, which helps us there. So those are some of the products that we can really use to maintain a terrain. And that is so important for our health as well as the microbiome's health. I think it's an understated philosophy. That's what I wanted to reiterate today, that hopefully people are writing down. Well, now we enter the colon. The colon's a critical piece because that's where things like constipation, things like diarrhea, that's where fermenting happens. So a lot of gas production that people experience happens in the colon. A lot of the issues can arise out of the colon that move back into the small intestine that we call SIBO. These terms that we throw around loosely, there's a lot of the colon that comes into play here. And there are a number of things we can do with colon. Again, these enzymes help as they get materials down to the colon. These enzyme formulas help reduce the bulk of that material to things that the colon wants to see. The L-gut helps with the terrain going from the stomach to the colon, right? But by the time we get to the colon, I'm hoping that the L-gut has done most of its work. So has LB gallbladder, and so has the pancreas formulas. Those have all done their work until we get to the colon. Well, what's going on in the colon now? The colon is the big fermenter. This unique organism, or excuse me, this unique organ, not organism, but organ that has the most dense probiotic and or microbiome in the body. It's just a huge, dense layer of these guys. Now, it's also much bigger in width, right? It's a much bigger opening that this big chunk of undigestible things can move through. But we got to keep it healthy. We got to keep the terrain going. We've let down there. So what are some things we can keep the terrain going? Well, there are plant compounds in each of these formulas that help maintain, that end up in the colon to help stimulate colonic work. And there's also other formulas that we could probably touch on, like C colon. Right, there's some compounds there. And then, of course, there are all of the probiotic and prebiotic formulas that we carry that I won't be able to talk about today that really have a major impact on the colon. A lot of the prebiotic formulas, whether it be the new Neuro Prebiota and or fiber, those are designed specifically for the colon. That's where the bulk of our organisms are.
So once we get down to the colon, we're looking more at the microbiome-related products.
Yeah. And remember, the colon is fed by the microbiome. They produce things like butyrates, which feed the colonic cells. So again, it's a very intimate relationship in the colon. And that terrain has to be maintained. And how do you maintain that terrain? A healthy set of compounds moving into a healthy set of digestive foods that you've eaten moving into there. And a lot of times, just call them prebiotics. Many of those are prebiotic in nature. These carbohydrates are prebiotic that helps build and maintain the terrain of the colon. A lot of them are plant-based that we don't normally refer to them as a prebiotic. For example, if you look at in the L-gut, when you look at some things like the grape root, the grape seed, the turmeric, what else do I have here? I have the butyrates, which we've already talked about, licorice. These all end up in the colon. And how they exert their effect there is they have a lot of these unique compounds we refer to as things like alkaloids. There are some that we refer to as flavonoids or polyphenolics. Not things you guys all have to remember, but what I want you to remember is that they contribute to the health of the colonic terrain, the colonic cells in the colonic terrain, and the colonic microbiome. And again, it's the interface between the microbiome and our tissue that needs to be maintained. And we've included those things into these formulas that we've just talked about today. So that brings us close to the end. I mean, minus some questions. I know that you had some concerns about when to use what, for example.
You know, maybe one of those questions would be when digestive enzyme support, people look at it as, okay, it's with or without food, it's still good for you. Still good for the patient. They take NZ or Z-gluten or Mela when they sit down and they eat a meal with protein or carbohydrates or fats. There's going to be benefit in helping to digest that meal, as you've touched on. Mm-hmm. They feel much lighter and like they can, just improve digestion, symptoms related to that. But then why would somebody use these on an empty stomach or a fasted state, if you want to call it, as compared to when they're eating it or when they're having it while they're eating?
That's a great question. I'm glad you touched on that because I would have forgotten that. That's where, remember I talked about that terrain. You can actually impact the terrain directly when you do this when you're fasting. If you consume these products, these enzymes, and L-gut on food, most of the energy of these products, most of the enzymatic energy, and some of the botanical energy ends up working on the food to help you digest the food, to help you get that food through your system and extract nutrients and so on. So it's really working for you with the food. We also, and I recommend what you just said, I recommend some of this protocol is taken on an empty stomach, and it's sometimes taken on a fed stomach or during feeding. During feeding, I just described why that's healthy. When you're empty, you can affect different things. For example, you can affect what's living, or what's stuck in that mucosal lining. And you can also interact more with the microbiota when the food isn't present. So these enzymes are going to be more accessible by the microbiota and that terrain the microbiota will live in when you are fasting state or when you do have no food going through you. Now you're chewing up carbohydrates, you're chewing up fats, and you're chewing up proteins that are stuck in the terrain, so you can help manage or clean. That's essentially the best way during a cleaning or to help maintain that terrain when you're not using food. I highly recommend that when you're doing that, like fasting and then eating some of these enzymes and some of these products, because they'll get directly into that mucosal and into our tissue much more rapidly. Otherwise, they spend a lot more time in the food process itself, especially enzymes.
For those who are fasting, whether it's 24-hour fast, whether it's even the water fast or intermittent fasting, it would be good to
at least do a course.
These.
Yeah, do a course of this or many courses of this during that time. Another way to think about this: those people that have ever done a colonic or examined the mucosa that comes out of the colon, you'll notice there's a lot of debris there. One of the ways to get rid of that debris is enzymes and other bioactive compounds from plants. That helps you digest the debris. Otherwise, the energy of your pancreas and your gallbladder and these enzymes are consumed by the food you've eaten. But when you're not eating food, that energy can be replaced into the stuff that's inside you already and the stuff that isn't moving through you right now, that's stuck in the mucosa. Get in there, chew it up, get it out. And that's a great way to put it. Yeah, I love that you asked that question. Yeah, so I would recommend at least a course of this on a fasting, a course of these enzyme protocol for sure. Because they have access to the mucosal and the biome in the tissue, and it's not being interfered with by the food simultaneously. Yeah, great question.
I think just another question that, which you've likely answered, is that there's patients that are on other protocols from systemic formulas, whether it's a cellular detoxification protocol, or if it's related to the thyroid, or it's related to the adrenals. Sometimes clients just want to be sure that, hey, is it okay if I align this with that protocol? Can I take this at the same time? Yeah. And I mean,
yeah, for the most part, these enzymes, absolutely. So these three formulas, Z-gluten, Mela, and Z, absolutely. There's no contraindication there. Unless somebody has a sensitivity to one of the botanicals in here, otherwise no. The enzyme part of them are completely safe and effective under any condition. We also, you have to be a little more concerned about where you're at in a protocol for something like leaky gut. Depending on where you're at. If you're still in the detox part of that, or if you're in we have a wellness purge and a wellness, a GI purge and GI wellness. If you're in those programs, again, yes, add more enzymes to those programs. These enzymes are amazing when you're dealing with either the purge phase or the wellness phase. You can increase your intake of any of these there, as well as this, as long as you're in this phase where the tight junctions need to be addressed. But beyond that, if you're in a different, whether you're on a TCD pack, a package of prep, body, brain, you can introduce an enzyme anywhere in there. You have to be a little more concerned when you get into the more specific formulas like L-gut, kidney, pancreas, liver, gallbladder. You might want to make sure you see where you're at with your patient, what phase they're in, to make sure you introduce it where it needs to be. But absolutely, introduce these formulas into other protocols. I think it just empowers that protocol even more. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, great question.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful, Dan.
There's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I wanted to summarize, the terrain is that little area between our microbiome and us, and it's where the microbiome lives and flourishes. And when the microbiome's flourishing in that terrain, it helps us flourish. And what affects that terrain are things like enzymes and nutrients and botanicals. And what we've discussed today is a healthy terrain will lead to a healthy microbiome from mouth all the way to rectum. So please, if I've said anything too quickly, rewatch this, watch it twice, watch it 3 times. If you have any questions, reach out to Mike or myself. And we're really glad you joined us. Please join us again, and make sure you look up and join us at our next live event, because we are pushing this terrain microbiome human experience to the next level. Over these next couple of years, you don't want to miss what we're going to be telling you. After saying that, thanks for joining me. This is exciting stuff. Hopefully we didn't get too heady, because this is really fun stuff, and hopefully that
You did.
you guys can use it in the clinic. Thanks.